Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you join us. Very warm welcome here from Victoria. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies here in Victoria, and the center has a great pleasure of hosting this panel today on the farmers' protest in India, an issue that doesn't get the proper coverage in our press, in the Western global North press. So we thought it would be good occasion now to shed light on what is happening in India, its local realities, its global implication. And we're very fortunate to have our own Nilesh Bose chairing today's panel. Nilesh is an associate professor and the Canada Research Chair in Global and Comparative History here at the University of Victoria. And with this and a great thank you, Nilesh, I hand it over to you to lead us into today's panel. So again, warm welcome here from the Center for Global Studies. Over to you, Nilesh.
Thank you, Oliver. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historic relationships with the land continue to this day. Today's panel is titled Understanding the India Farmer Protests, Local Laws and Global Implications. Today, as chair, I will just briefly introduce the topic and the panelists before the program begins. About the Q&A, which we will do after about 45 minutes of conversation, the audio of the audience is disabled, but at any time during the program, those who have questions are encouraged to type them out in the chat box to everybody. I will then collect them and they will be sent to me for screening. And after the conversation is over, I'll read them the Q&A, and we'll continue until about 1:30 p.m. So as everyone here knows, since the end of last November, hundreds of thousands of farmers, mostly from the agricultural states of the Punjab and Haryana, have been protesting the passing of 3 new laws passed by the parliament and supported by the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. Farmers are afraid that the new laws will make their crops vulnerable to larger corporations without government intervention. This panel here will focus on understanding the protests, understanding the new laws, 3 laws, and the global repercussions of both. Rather than a traditional panel with 3 papers, this will be a conversation facilitated by Bikram Gill, one of our panelists. So now I'll just introduce everybody and then we will move into the conversation. Bikram is a scholar of international political economy and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech, where he is also core faculty in the Aspect doctoral program. He works on the global intersections of political economy, race, and ecology, and he explores these as they bear upon issues of agriculture and development, the climate crisis, and decolonization. His work has appeared in many journals, including Environment and Planning, Politics, and Globalizations. The next panelist is Bikrum Gill, a scholar of modern South Asian and global history. He is assistant professor in the Department of History at William Patterson University, and his research explores questions of agrarian change, labor history, caste, and post-colonial critique, as well as global capitalism. His work has been published in a variety of venues, including the Journal of Asian Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, and Al Jazeera. Our final panelist is Natasha Bell, associate professor in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. And she works on issues of democratic equality and how democratic equality remains an unrealized aspiration and potential ways to create more egalitarian relations in liberal democracies and in academia. Dr. Bell's book, Gendered Citizenship, Understanding Gendered Violence in Democratic India, is published by Oxford University Press. Her work has also appeared in a number of venues, including Global Feminisms, Comparative Politics, Politics of India, and Everyday Forms of Political Resistance. She's also written for the Washington Post and Public Seminar. So we will begin now by turning it over to Bikram Gill, who will start off the conversation.
Thank you, Nilesh, for the introductions. Thank you all for joining us today. I just wanted to clarify, the audio is okay? I'm being heard okay? Yeah, okay, good. So I think, yeah, we'll just get right into it. I thought we could start with a kind of general introductory discussion. I know we've all spoken on the protests at different points and written about it. And there was some background information circulated, but just to begin, Natasha and Navyug, if you could maybe share with us all what maybe you think what are the major kind of motivating issues of the protests? What has brought hundreds of thousands of farmers out to the streets? So it's obviously to protest these specific laws, but what is it about the content of these laws, the mode that they were implemented, that has generated such opposition?
You want to start, Natasha, maybe, or?
Navyug, you start, and then I'll add to what you said.
Right, sure. So thank you, Bikram and Nilesh, and of course to the Center for Global Studies at University of Victoria, Oliver, Jody, Stephanie. It's been wonderful to have this event and sort of come together in this way, and to see so many people sort of participating or joining this conversation. We are, I think, living through a very extraordinary moment in South Asian history, in global history. To Bikram's question about what has sort of brought people together, I think we can kind of maybe paint a bit of a broader sort of timeline. The movement emerged actually over the summer when these 3 laws were first promulgated by the BJP-led government. As soon as people in Punjab and Haryana got word that these laws were going to be implemented, they started to mobilize. And they had rallies, they had marches, small-level protests, because immediately they knew that the content of these laws would devastate their society. And that sort of mobilization, which I think sort of gets overlooked sometimes because we sort of jump to sort of November and sort of the amazing, incredible events of marching on Delhi, is essential to understand how people became aware and how they became emboldened to fight against a very authoritarian government. So over the summer, this mobilization occurs. The people in Punjab and Haryana especially are demanding a repeal of these laws. The government ignores them. They are passed officially in September. The movement escalates. There are large-scale protests across Punjab, shutting down petrol pumps and railways and the malls of the major corporations that are going to benefit from the changes. That also has no effect on the government. So finally, in November, there's the call to march onto the Capitol. And that's what happens on November 26th to 27th. They cross the Punjab-Haryana border and set up these sort of barricades on the outskirts of the capital city. And from then on, we've been at a kind of impasse where the government is refusing to listen to the people, and the protests are adamant about having a full repeal of these laws. And then from that resistance, I think we see all sorts of broader kind of imaginaries emerging in terms of the future of agrarian politics in the subcontinent.
So I'll now pick up and just add to what Navyug has said. I think he's absolutely right that period from June to September was key in the political education of rural citizens throughout Punjab and Haryana. And then we internationally and nationally understood what was happening in November, in November 26th through 28th with the march on Delhi. And now we're in a different period where the march has occurred and now camps have been established. Protest camps have been established. Those camps have now have militarized borders around them. There's this constant fear of violence that may ensue any moment, right, from the state, but also from the state taking a blind eye, right, to other citizens being violent against these protesters. And what I want to really kind of tap into is the other imaginaries that Navyug has spoken to. And I think what's happening in this particular political moment is incredible. And I am truly just in awe of what is happening. What I believe has happened in the past almost 101 days, I think next week we'll hit that mark. But what has happened in this time period is that in the face of an authoritarian and anti-democratic state, protesters have created democratic cities on the outskirts of Punjab. Right? They have literally created their own cities that are running in a democratic fashion against an illiberal state. And they're providing all kinds of public services that the state would and should provide, from schools, from medical camps, langar seva, right? Food through communal kitchens, arts and music. They have done the work of establishing these democratic spaces and are running these cities as democratic spaces. And then there's a connection and linkage to rural spaces. And so it is Punjab and Haryana that continue to support what's happening at the border. And they are sending, through gurdwaras and other organizations, they are sending villagers who rotate. Right? They'll spend a week to 10 days at the protest site. They'll return back to the village to care for land and family and do other kinds of labor. They're sending all the kinds of essentials you need, from milk to vegetables and rice and flour, right? And so there's this connection between what's happening outside of Delhi to those rural spaces that is making the protest possible.
Thank you. That was excellent kind of opening comments. And what I'm hearing that you both emphasized is a kind of prefigurative politics, right? So there is something that is being opposed, right? And there's an endpoint to the demands of the repeal of the laws. But both Natasha and Navyog, you seem to suggest that in this ferment, in the actual process of opposition, something is being prefigured. Potentially a different food system is already, we see the outlines of something else that is possible. And this is not, I think, to build on what you both are saying, and some of Navyog's earliest comments, this is not something that just is emerging out of nowhere. It's building on years and decades of organizing and struggle. We have to keep this in mind, although the bills are being passed now. What we're seeing in this prefigurative politics, the langar, or the kind of democratic politics, they are rooted in particular issues, and I do want to come back to that and kind of continue with this discussion. I just wanted to add to some points that were said regarding what are motivating the issues. And I know you both mentioned the farm laws, and I know both of you, and I would encourage everybody to read both Navyog and Natasha's writings on this. They've gone much into greater detail. But the content of the laws themselves, I think it's also, there's a reason why this is such a historical kind of uprising instead of protests, right? Because these laws are threatening the livelihoods of farmers in South Asia, but this is something that confronts agricultural producers across the global South more generally, right? This is a broad agricultural kind of crisis and contestation. And just to be very brief about it, the content of the laws, what they threaten to do is to transform the food and agricultural system from one that is still managed in significant ways publicly, right? That is still oriented towards logics and values of food self-sufficiency. The livelihood of agricultural producers still has a significant influence on how agriculture is organized, how agricultural goods are produced and exchanged, how food is distributed through a public distribution system. It is being effectively transferred to a profit-seeking private sector, the fear of which is that these private actors through these laws will be able to corner the agricultural markets, right? They'll be able to buy low, sell high, right? They will be able to integrate Indian agriculture into a global system, and agricultural producers will have their livelihoods squeezed, and consumers of food in India will potentially have less access to food through a subsidized food distribution system. So I think there is much at stake at the laws itself. Navyog, were you going to?
Yeah, I think maybe we ought to maybe spell out some of the sort of like what these laws are in case people are not up to speed. Did you want to do that, or?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So yeah, I think just to get everybody sort of on the same page, there are 3 laws that were passed in September, and what they together do is deregulate and privatize the agricultural sector. So the first law allows private corporations to purchase crops at market prices directly from farmers. That might sound like a sort of benign thing, but we have to keep in mind that the existing system is that farmers sell their crop to government wholesale markets called mandis at minimum support prices. So the existing arrangement is that farmers' produce is guaranteed a price set by the government, and it's purchased by government agents in these wholesale markets. What the first law does is create a parallel system. So there will be these government markets with their minimum support prices, and then there will be these private markets where corporations can buy directly from farmers. What that will do is, like we've seen with sort of parallel privatization schemes elsewhere, is they might initially offer a little bit more money to entice farmers to sell in these private markets. Once they do that for 1 or 2 or 3 seasons, when the public markets no longer have anyone selling to them, they will inevitably fold up and collapse. And at that point, the farmers will be completely at the mercy of these corporations to dictate the price of the crops they buy. So that's the kind of bait and switch privatization model. The second law removes government protections on stockpiling essential commodities. So the government of India has a kind of list of commodities that they do not allow private companies to stockpile. What this second law does is remove those restrictions. So private corporations can, when prices are low, buy manipulate the supply chain at both ends. The third law is the one that allows private corporations to engage in contract farming with farmers without due legal recourse. So they can kind of, at the beginning of a growing season, set up an arrangement with a farmer to buy a certain crop at a certain price. And then when it's time for harvest, if the prices have gone lower, they will just buy the crop and benefit from that early arrangement. If the prices have gone higher and they don't want to pay the extra price, they have all the power in the world to deny a portion for spurious reasons. And the farmer is not able to take the corporation to a proper court. Instead, it will be adjudicated by a sessional district magistrate, which will have very less power. And on top of that, one can hardly imagine any farmer taking a large corporation to court anyway. So in all 3 ways, these laws are nothing more than a corporate handover. This is not to say that the existing system was working perfectly. There were immense flaws in how agricultural sort of procurement and distribution worked. But farmer unions had been demanding changes to the existing system for 5 decades, and the government ignored them, and then sort of imposed these laws without consultation, which will actually make the lives of people far more precarious and miserable. So that's maybe just a bit of a kind of snapshot as to what the actual content of these laws are. They are a bit sort of complicated. There is this kind of euphemism and sort of bait and switch. So one has to kind of cut through some of that. And the remarkable thing, maybe as Natasha was mentioning, is that people on the ground are acutely aware of this. They are absolutely crystal clear on what the effect of these laws will be. We don't have the kind of confusion and mystification that maybe we've experienced elsewhere.
Natasha, did you want to add? I had a question for you specifically, but if you wanted to add, go ahead.
I'll take the specific question, but I just wanted to add a little bit of information for the context. So it's precisely as Navyug has said with the 3 laws, and then the context is that these farmers are small farmers. Most of them, something like 85, 86% have under 5 acres of land. They already are overburdened by debt right? Decades of debt. And this is the very population in which we find high rates of suicide. And so you're asking these very small farmers to now enter into this private market and somehow compete when we know full right what the outcome will be.
Right. And Natasha, I know in your writings and in some of your opening comments, you emphasized or you linked, let's say, what's happening around the farm laws and the protests with the kind of BJP government's mode of operation more broadly, right? And we are right now at the 1-year anniversary of the horrific kind of pogroms, the hunting down of Muslims on the streets of Delhi one year ago, February of 2020. So could you speak a bit about, if you can, about the way in which maybe how is there also, there's the content of the laws, but also the manner in which they were promulgated and implemented. Does that feed into also the opposition? And what does that say about the BJP's mode of governance more generally?
I'm glad you brought this up, that we're at this 1-year anniversary mark. So in December of 2019, the BJP government brought the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, combined with 2 other laws, which in essence allows for citizenship for some minority religious communities from outside of India, right? From Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, but it specifically excludes Muslims. So Sikh populations, other populations have access to the citizenship right, but Muslims are excluded. And once you add that with the other 2 laws that are around registration and keeping track of people, what the BJP government has done is really to devise a legal system so as to render the Muslim minority population in India stateless, to strip them of their citizenship right and to render them stateless. And so it is from within this, and what followed the passage of CAA was a 101-day sit-in that was led primarily by Muslim women in Delhi itself, and that sit-in came to an end because of COVID. And so this is the backdrop, at least the kind of most immediate backdrop within which these laws are being passed. And what we see is that the BJP government is violently excluding both politically and economically minorities throughout India. The relationship with the Sikh population is slightly different than the one with the Muslim population in India, because of the Hindu nationalist narrative that sees Sikhism as somehow part and parcel of Indian soil, and Islam is outside of it, and therefore does not have any room for Muslim minorities within their understanding of a Hindu nation. So there are current protests, but this is the backdrop, and we cannot overlook the relationship between Hindu nationalism and these protests, and the very precarious lived experience of minorities, irrespective of what what particular minority group we talk about. And as we know, the Sikh population in India has always been targeted. It doesn't matter who has been in a position of power, right? And here we can look to the relationship between the Sikh community and the Congress Party, and 1984, and Operation Blue Star, and that history. And so the Sikh population within India is very much aware of their minority status and the excesses of a violent state.
Thank you. So I think that's a really fascinating, disturbing, kind of but really important link here between, we have a set of protests kind of centered more on a political economy issue, it seems like, right? But I think linking it to the Hindutva project, to Hindu nationalism, and you pose this kind of link between Hindutva potentially and global political economy and political economy forces. And you know, somebody who used to be a professor at the University of Victoria Political Science Department, Radhika Desai, she's written a really important book about 20 years ago called Slouching Towards Ayodhya, which at the time was thinking about the relationship between Hindutva, Indian capital, and global capital. And I know there's I know Ravinder Kaur, who I think is, because I can see who's in the audience, who I think is attending, has also written about the links between Hindutva and global capital and national capital. I think to add on to some of what, and so yeah, let's come back to talk about that for sure. To add on to some of what you were saying there, Natasha, I think also it seems as though there's a way in which the bills were then promulgated and passed, and Navyug, I think you were suggesting this as well, in a way that did not in any sense take into account the demands or the kind of knowledge of farmers themselves, right? So this 5-decade-long set of proposals that have constantly been put forth to reform the agricultural sector, these are entirely ignored. So the bills are kind of passed in a very authoritarian manner as well, right? That does not kind of integrate these constituencies into the decision-making process. One thing that I would add on to the point around what's at stake with the bills is that I think a lot of the farmer unions and a lot of kind of what Navyug was talking about have definitely emphasized that there is so much at stake, because the history of India's economic growth over the past 20, 30 years has been a jobless kind of economic growth, right? There's been no suggestion that when people leave the agricultural sector, if you're pushed out by powerful corporate actors, that there's any jobs waiting for you in any other sector, right? So I think that's what's also fueling, you hear this kind of anxiety that farmers have that we're going to become a surplus category of labor, right? That there's no jobs on the other side if we get pushed out of the agricultural sector. Navyug and Natasha, could you maybe speak a little bit more about, I know you've already talked about the different unions and the different kind of mobilizing forces activating kind of the protests, but if we were to think about the farm laws and the protests as a kind of site of contestations between different actors, right? Like, who could we identify as the primary? I mean, we've talked about farmers, farm unions, and the corporate sector, but who do you think are the kind of the major players in these contestations?
Yeah, I mean, I could, I have a couple of things to say to that, but maybe I think the point you just made, actually, Bikram, is maybe worth emphasizing. The point about the manner in which the bills were passed and how to kind of think about that. I think it brings sort of maybe 3 points to the fore. The first is the way these bills were passed, they were clearly sort of violating sort of existing conventional procedure, right? As you mentioned, farmer labor unions were not consulted when they were devising these bills. They were actually in league with the Ambani and Adani corporations during a pandemic. And then when opposition sort of emerged in Punjab and then later Haryana, it was ignored by the government. And then in September, there was a kind of special session of parliament. You can actually, people can watch this online. You see there was a kind of voice vote against sort of hand counting and a lot of commotion in the Lok Sabha, and sort of they were forced through. So clearly procedure was violated to an extent. At another level though, we can ask the question, what if procedure was followed perfectly? And I think that's part of sort of the BJP's sort of arrogance, that even if they didn't violate these norms, the BJP has 303 seats in the Lok Sabha out of 543. They have a majority. And Punjab has 13 seats, Haryana has 10 seats. So these states will never matter in the kind of electoral calculations of the Indian sort of state. These states are 53 million people, which might not sound a lot compared to 1.3 billion, but it's more than Spain or Colombia or South Korea. India is a kind of massive country, 80 years old. And the question becomes, should people in Punjab or Haryana have their economy and society held hostage just because they don't have as many people? So what actually is democracy, right? If you're going to kind of force bills that are going to have a detrimental effect on one part of the country disproportionately, Do they have any say in a kind of democratic framework to oppose that? Or are they just at the whim of this kind of crude tally of numbers? I think that is a question to put on the table across the world. It's a question that happens in Canada all the time with Alberta and Newfoundland, and what makes the union there. In the US, of course, there's a question between states' rights and sort of senators and congresspersons and that arrangement. So this is actually a real question that we have to actually rethink what democracy is. The last point that comes from this is part of what Natasha was saying as well, is the way the BJP positions itself and why it's being so insistent, right? The image is that this is a party led by a strong leader. It is, Modi is uncompromising and he is determined. And I think we hear this in a lot of different places. We hear this in Brazil, we hear this in Hungary, in the Philippines, the idea in Turkey of having a strong leader. We should ask ourselves, what does it mean to have a strong leader? And I think the answer, or part of the answer, is that a strong leader is designed to intimidate their own population into compliance. It's designed to kind of ensure people are afraid and sort of docile and follow what the leader says. And I think what's happening in Punjab is a kind of challenge to that logic. It actually reveals the contempt the BJP have towards their own citizens, and the fact that people are not going to just sort of put up with a leader sort of telling them what to do. And they can kind of force different issues onto the agenda. So I think that's sort of maybe how we could kind of hold those, the issue of procedure together. Natasha, did you want to talk about the interests involved, and then maybe I can come back? Then.
That sounds good. I think that one of the key fault lines, if we're going to use the farmers' protests as kind of the prism through which to see these interest groups, one of those kind of key fault lines is around caste. And so two groups that have come together in a way that, at least from what I understand, is absolutely unprecedented, are farm laborers and farm owners. And so you have high caste land owning farmers who tend to be Jat, some Khatri, primarily Jat, and then you have lower caste Dalit landless laborers. And these two communities historically have experienced great deals of oppression between the two groups. And what's interesting for me is that I have done, this is kind of the space of my scholarship, that there's a gap between the Sikh ideals of egalitarianism and the practice of Sikh faith throughout Punjab, throughout the diaspora, and caste is one of those fault lines. And here in this movement, we see something different. There's a contingent solidarity that is being built across caste in very powerful ways. And it doesn't mean that it is going to somehow erase caste difference altogether, but what it has done is to acknowledge historical kind of oppression and to recognize that that at this moment, against the reform laws and against there's an alliance against privatization, because the labor relations, even with a small farmer for the Dalit farm workers, is better than the prospect of no labor with privatization, right? And so there's this, I have been just reading and watching and trying to follow as carefully as possible, because this for me is new. New in the Sikh community, new in Punjab, new in kind of progressive politics in India. And so that is one fault line that I think we should maybe focus on and highlight.
Yeah, and just to maybe sort of pick up on that and look at the other end of the spectrum, maybe to add to Bikram's question, I think the interest behind these laws, we could kind of, again, we maybe have to sort of compile them, because they're varied in a sense. On the one hand, of course, it's the BJP government at the sort of forefront of pushing these laws, right? This is the government in power. They've been in power for 7 years now, led by Narendra Modi, right? But the objective of deregulating and privatizing agriculture is an agenda shared by the Congress. So this is not just a sort of mandate of one party. Both the Congress and the BJP, their sort of outlook for agriculture is removing government involvement, turning it to private interests, and sort of letting the situation proceed in that direction. This will sound similar when we talk about the Democrats and the Republicans. It will sound similar for the liberals and the conservatives. It will sound similar in England and all sorts of other places, that the two major political parties don't have much of a difference. So that's one set of interests. They are committed to a kind of neoliberal agenda. Adding, of course, the BJP has this Hindutva sort of right-wing, politics of assimilation and hatred towards minorities, and the fact that this movement emerged in Punjab, led by Sikh, has kind of added their vitriol. The other layer would be private corporations, the Adanis and Ambanis, and these sort of large, companies that have their hands in all sorts of areas of the economy, see agriculture as a place where they can make their most profits, especially because India was in a recession last year. They're going to be in a recession next year, and the only sector that's still buoyant is agriculture. Then, of course, Bikram, your own kind of work talks about this last area, which is global capital and Western governments, which have actually been at the forefront of trying to force countries in the global south to remove subsidies and protections while hypocritically keeping them intact in their own countries, which actually benefit these large agribusinesses and not so much kind of independent farmers in Canada or America or elsewhere. So I think there's a kind of layering of the interests aligned on the other side. And of course, again, you would kind of know more and maybe be able to kind of detail some of those threads.
Yeah, thanks, Navyug. I would love the chance to maybe speak to the kind of some of the global dimensions of what's happening, because I think that gets maybe de-emphasized sometimes. Now, it's important to center, I guess, the authoritarian abuses of the Modi government and what's happening. But, just 2 years ago, the BJP government was actually taken to task by the European Union, by Canada, by Western governments in the World Trade Organization for offering too much support to farmers, right? So when Trudeau was elevated as a hero a couple months back, it was a very classic Justin Trudeau move, a very performative politics with no substance, right? So he says, yes, do not punish the farmers, as his government has repeatedly taken India to the World Trade Organization in opposition to subsidies offered to farmers, right? And by the Biden administration, the proposed agricultural secretary, Tom Vilsack, when he was the secretary under the Obama administration, in 2014 and 15, led an aggressive coalition of Western governments, Canada, Australia, United States, the European Union, again, pushing back against China and India's minimum support prices, right? So, and 2 years ago, the European Union asked the Modi government explicitly, how come you're proposing to uplift farmer livelihoods by 2021-22? How are you going to do this and maintain your commitment to the WTO policy on subsidies for the farm sector, right? So I think we have to be very mindful that what the agricultural policies that are being promoted by the BJP government are supported consistently by the European Union. Not only have they been promoted, they have been using structural adjustment policies, debt mechanisms to push these policies on global south states since the 1980s. Right? The African agricultural crisis of the 80s and 90s was very much a product of these sorts of policies being pushed upon African states. At that time, the Indian agrarian crisis of the 2000s is an outcome of the policies that the World Bank and the IMF pushed through in the 1991 reforms onto the Indian agricultural sector, which in the first instance reduced input subsidies available to farmers. It reduced credit available to farmers, right? It led to a massive epidemic of farmer suicides. And why are Western agribusiness so interested in global agribusiness, so interested in the Indian market, in addition to the Ambanis and the Adanis, right? Why are they also? Well, since the 1970s and 1980s, whether it's Canadian, American, or European agribusiness, they've confronted a crisis of overproduction, right? Where they produce too much agricultural production. Well, it's not too much, because we know there's hunger problems in the United States too. It's the irrationality of capitalist agriculture, right? That there is no equivalent of a centralized public distribution system, however much it's been undermined under neoliberal policies. But so you have this, these massive agribusiness in the Midwest and on the prairies, that they look to India, they look to African states as potential markets to dump their goods. Okay, you see right now there's massive protests happening in Haiti. At the moment, the Haitian rice agricultural sector was totally decimated by similar policies, right? So this is a global South problem more generally. And now in terms of the contemporary laws, Navyug was referencing some of my work, like I've looked at a particular company, Cargill, which has very close relations with the Modi government. So this is one of the largest American privately held companies. It's a massive kind of agribusiness grain trading company. And when Modi came to power, when the BJP was reelected, or came to power a second time in 2014, Cargill was very excited. And they put forward a lot of kind of excitement about how they were going to increase their investment in Indian agriculture because they think the market is going to be more liberalized, right? So there is definitely a kind of global dimension to this, which is not how we might necessarily assume that it works, right? So, and we can come back to that maybe more in the discussion. I'm mindful of time, but I do think that's something worth talking about further, and I'm happy to do so. What I wanted to maybe touch on before opening it up for the Q&A, because I know Nilesh, we're kind of getting close to time to switch, is both Natasha and Navyug. I think Navyug, you had particularly mentioned this, that it's not that the system prior to these laws was perfect by any means, right? That farmers had for 5 decades now, farmer unions been promoting or asking for reforms, but of a different nature, right? And I think that's important to discuss because I think, and here we're talking about the Green Revolution and maybe the first round of neoliberal reforms, they figure into the crisis that the BJP now claims to be solving, because there is a crisis, there is a deep agricultural crisis, but the question is, how do you approach that crisis, right? Not anything, things can intensify. So these bills might intensify rather than resolve the crisis, right? So maybe can we speak a little bit about the pre-existing kind of crisis, whether the fallout of the Green Revolution or whatever kind of other historical context, either you both may think is important to keep in mind here.
Yeah.
Navyug space. नहीं है तो थी बोलो जी.
Yeah, that's a very important framing you have, Bikram. So the reason, I think we do have to maybe give a bit of context about the Green Revolution to help people understand why these protests are the sort of focal point is Punjab and Punjab and Haryana, and now Rajasthan and Western UP and elsewhere. The protests are sort of centered in those 2 states because those were the places where this experiment called the Green Revolution, this particular form of sort of developmental capitalism, was first hatched and deployed. We have to remember that after 1947, with independence, India was a kind of impoverished country on the brink of famine, massive food shortages, importing grain. And so there was a kind of need to address and alleviate rural poverty. At the same time, this was the moment of sort of decolonization across the world, inspiring anti-colonial revolutionary movements that were not just expelling foreign colonizers, but actually transforming economic relations in other countries. And so there was also kind of rural peasant sort of militancy afoot in India. And I think you've mentioned this elsewhere in your work, where there was really a fear of a red revolution that caused the Indian government to adopt what became known as the Green Revolution. And that was using, sponsored by the World Bank and the State Department and funded by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, the deployment of a set of strategies and technologies designed to increase agricultural output. These were high yield seed varieties, chemical pesticides and fertilizers, and mechanization through tractors and tube wells. So this sort of bundle of technologies was sort of cooked up, designed, and then sort of sent to India. And the places they deployed it were in Punjab, primarily because it had not only exceptionally fertile soil and abundant groundwater, but also because it had a kind of self-cultivating, experienced peasantry with small land holdings that was able to kind of, they thought, make use of these technologies. Now, in order to get farmers to adopt these technologies, they created those two infrastructures, the Mandi system and the MSP. And that was the incentive to get farmers to adopt this very capitalist, chemical-intensive agriculture. And that's what happened. There was an exponential increase in crop yields. Year after year, grain and rice output doubled and tripled, so that by the 70s and 80s, Punjab, being 1.5% of the territory, with about 2% of the population, produced 60 to 70% of the grain and rice that fed the entire country. So it was an astounding kind of output. And as you mentioned, at the same time, deepened all of these fissures over caste tensions, over gender hierarchy, over inequality in farmer suicides and land ownership, and of course, environmental degradation. And right from that moment, actually, observers on the ground, farmer unions, but economists, sociologists, religious figures, political parties, all demanded a different agricultural model. They all said this was unsustainable, unviable, it's going to end in disaster. And that is where there's been this sort of state-mandated amnesia by saying, well, agriculture is in a bad state, and so we had to pass these laws. No, people demanded them from the 70s onward. And there's actually government commissions, the most famous being the Swaminathan Commission, that the government actually sponsored to address the agrarian crisis. Their findings were sort of published and shelved. And so when the BJP sort of puts forward this set of bills, they're doing so in the face of kind of a long-standing debate and conversation and a set of demands for a different agricultural system. And that's what's so galling. And so when this protest sort of emerged, it's about repealing these three laws, but there are now all sorts of ideas that are sort of permeating the protest sites and in Punjab and Haryana and sort of throughout the country, that we're not going to just go back to a status quo, that actually we're going to come up with a different agricultural model and that we're going to implement it in our states. The future of every peasant is not necessarily to become a proletariat, that there's actually something else we can do. We don't have to kind of mindlessly mimic the kind of European trajectory of displacing people from the countryside and moving them into cities and they work manufacturing jobs. That is a kind of imaginary sort of capitalist sort of fantasy. And in a place like India, we don't have these kinds of massive industrial sort of factories in the cities. Instead, we have to actually pull out a different trajectory. And I think the last point I'll say maybe is that this is the lesson for the rest of the world, that neoliberalism is not an inevitability, that one can actually come up with different ways to plot an alternative future. And I think the really remarkable statement from US farmer unions that came out a couple of days ago, they actually say this. They say that this was the agenda that was imposed on us 40 years ago. We lost this battle, and it's being fought now in India. And so there's actually a potential for a radical sort of break. And I think everywhere in the world, we ought to kind of invest in that possibility and throw our support behind this movement.
I want to add to what Navi just said. Thank you for saying that. And I want to add that we often think that somehow progressive movements are urban, exist in the West, and are secular. And what the farmers' protest is showing us, that none of that need be true, right? They are challenging every one of those assumptions. And what they're revealing to us is that there's a democratic potential, a progressive potential within religious practice, even within a liberal democracy. And that is something that I think most of us, scholars and activists alike, are unaware of or blind to, but the farmers protesters, the protesters themselves are demonstrating.
Thank you, Natasha. I just wanted to add on to a little bit of what you both said, and then maybe hand it over to Nilesh for the Q&A. I think the idea of the Green Revolution, and thank you, Navyug, for that brief but very concise summary of what it was. You know, for many of us who are scholars of the region, but also come out of these histories ourselves, it's a very personal and often very painful discussion about what happened in the 60s and 70s, right? There was so much that was being fought for in terms of different modes of agricultural life. There was demands for land ceilings, for land reforms, right? When you think what would happen with regards to gender and caste, as Natasha emphasized, out of the Green Revolution, right? When you think about how more land was enclosed for mechanized farms, what that meant for women, for Dalits, right? For people who had access to common pasture lands that surrounded the villages, how much was left behind and assumed to have been in a past that could not be recovered, right? That there was a different availability, a different option, whether drawing on the Sikh tradition or the kind of explosion of Marxist-Leninist kind of movements in the 60s and 70s, the Naxalites. Like we forget that the Naxalite movement kind of really begins in many ways or becomes most prominent in Punjab in the 60s and 70s. And it's a demand for a different agricultural system. And the Green Revolution, just to add a little bit to what Navyug says, was saying to really understand kind of how the BJP and the Congress have justified neoliberal reforms over the decades. What they have argued is that the Green Revolution model became unsustainable. They say they kept saying that the subsidies we give farmers is too much of a drain on the state's budget, right? But why does it become a drain is because year after year, farmers have to put more fertilizers and more pesticides. When I go to Punjab, if you go, you'll often see them digging a foot deeper, right? Digging off the topsoil and going further because the soil has become so damaged from this kind of ecologically exhaustive form of agriculture. Right? So there are rising costs to this form of agriculture. And the response by the state has been, okay, well, then we need to entirely stop subsidizing this rather than shifting resources towards a sustainable form of agriculture, right? Rather than Punjab was not always monocrop, wheat, rice, right? There are, I just know even 2 generations back, my own grandfather would have been doing polycropping, right? You would have had a system, a very different system of agriculture in place. This is not the only model available. And so what we have is both a prefigurative politics now, but also one that is suggesting that what was lost in the past wasn't lost forever, right? That those kinds of, that lineage, that tradition, whether it's Sikh, whether it's Marxist, whether it's some other tradition that was opposing that Green Revolution model, that one can still tap into that. I think that's something to keep in mind, is that just because the Green Revolution model was in crisis, that this is not the only direction that one needs to go. So I think we're okay to open to Q&A if there are questions that have been received.
Yes, first I would like to thank everybody, Natasha, Navyug, and Bikram, for such a rich conversation. There's so much here that stuck out to me that I'm going to take a little time just to mention a few things that really stuck with me. And there's a question that I will pose, and I'll just take 1 minute to say a few things before I get to the question. A few issues that really stuck to me is a point that Natasha made about contingent solidarities, which I think are being noticed across the spectrum, that point to both different histories that need to be uncovered, to speak to Bikram's point, and to think about the future in different ways. Another issue that I think is really important that was mentioned is the crisis of overproduction, which is a well-known issue in the history of capitalism and in the history, agrarian histories throughout the world, is now taking on new directions in terms of legal, political, cultural changes that are attendant upon that crisis. And as Navyug mentioned, the transition from a peasant to a proletarian, this is something that, again, we know from various perspectives throughout the world, we are confronting this world in a different way, I think, because of the protests right now. I have a variety of specific questions that were prompted by this, but I'm going to resist for now and get to the questions that were posed earlier. So I'll read out one question that was posed. Could you talk a bit about the coalitional structures that pre-exist and are now powering the current movement? Specifically, the work of rural unions within Punjab, the cumulative experience built from localized struggles over the few decades where labor unions and farmers groups have worked together to build organizational capacities. So that's one. And then the new national coalitions of rural unions and peasant groups that have emerged since around 2015. And that's to the group, but I would gather perhaps Bikram, you could start, but I think everybody would be able to address that question.
I would actually say maybe Navyag, you want to maybe start with that one, because I know you've been speaking a lot about the unions and the farmer groups.
Yeah, it's an important question. It's quite remarkable, this contingent solidarity that we're talking about that's been forged between farmer and laborer unions. And part of the reason why it's so remarkable and part of the reason why it's so contingent is that there is actually a tension between farmers and laborers. Sometimes mazdoor is translated as laborer, sometimes it's translated as worker, but the people we're talking about here are landless agricultural laborers. So they are workers in a sense, they work in the countryside alongside farmers. And the tension is simply that they are usually employees of farmers. And these farmers, though, are not absentee landlords, owning thousands of acres. They are themselves self-cultivating, but the landless laborers work alongside them during planting and harvesting and sort of in other activities. So this is part of the kind of, I think, conceptual difficulty we have when we think of peasant as a kind of lone individual just plowing a field. It's actually, there's all sorts of groups that sort of participate in agricultural production. But the farmer and laborer unions have forged this solidarity. Usually the farmers unions have a kind of laborer allied union wing, and they sort of work together. And the tension, like I said, is that they are, the laborers are employed by the farmers own the land and want a higher purchase price for their crop, and the laborers either want access to land or a higher wage. Nonetheless, they see that these laws are going to devastate everyone in Punjab, everyone in Haryana, and everyone throughout the country, right? It starts with farmers and laborers, but it goes to urban workers, professionals, shopkeepers, traders, students, and as Natasha was mentioning, the kind of public distribution system that the vast majority of Indians are still dependent on, the subsidized food grains that are kind of distributed through schools and other programs. So this will actually have that ripple effect. They've been engaged in sort of confronting small scale issues throughout Punjab for decades and had several successes and several defeats. We don't have to be romantic about this, right? There's been setbacks. These movements have been kind of crushed and dispersed, and they've regrouped and reemerged. So it is that, I think, and I think maybe the question is trying to kind of point to the years and years of experience and sort of solidarity that has been forged that form the basis of the remarkable events over the summer and then in the fall. And I think a lot of the farmer unions especially have made commitments to stand in solidarity with laborers and go back to Punjab and address the demands of Dalits and landless peoples for access to common land, for higher wages, to end the kind of segregation and caste atrocities that we witness. So this is very much in the kind of air. Where it will lead, how deep it will go, these are open questions. It's not settled, it's not for sure. We shouldn't have illusions about it. But that is, I guess, what is part of thinking about a struggle as it unfolds. We are not doing an autopsy of something that happened years ago. It's happening live right now. So we got to be able to kind of speak to issues in their fluidity.
Natasha, did you want to?
I want to, not directly to the question, but I want to add in how gender is operating as well within the unions and within the protests. And what has been, what I have found remarkable is that there are women leaders throughout the unions, both, right, with the farmer unions and the laborer unions. And what they have said and done, I think, is important. They've acknowledged, and they are forcing others at the protests to acknowledge, right, that the labor that sustains the protests is gendered in itself, right? And what they're saying is that our gendered labor is often invisible in the fields, but what we want it to be visible at the protest sites. And they're making it a point, right, that women's labor is visible at the protest site. And so that is also and this is also a shift and change, because often these are male spaces where we don't find women in a position of power, and women making decisions and women claiming space, right? And here, that when they have claimed space, leaders have stepped back and given them space. And that's a shift from what I've seen in the past.
Yeah, and I think I would just maybe add to what Natasha is saying, just in some ways to link it to just the gender point. I think is really critical, because the invisible labor, right? And I think it's caste and gender in the countryside of Punjab in this way. When you think about the mechanization of agriculture, the intensification of mechanization through the Green Revolution, the mechanization has always mostly been associated with the kind of masculinization of agriculture, right? Where the image of the farmer becomes a man, and labor becomes concentrated, and women's work in the fields, either it becomes enclosed, so everything becomes subjected to the machine, or it becomes invisible. And I think that's something very powerful, I would agree. And I think one person who the case of Nadeep Kaur, kind of really brings together a lot of what both of you were talking about, right? I think the Dalit kind of activist, she still is under detention by the government, but she was bringing kind of labor and farmer and kind of gender questions all together. So I think maybe that's something we can talk about her case a little more. But one thing I just wanted to add in response to Tanya's question is the kind of years or decades of work of rural unions in Punjab. And I know, Navyug, you've also spoken about this recently. You know, some of these unions have been fighting prior to the passing of these laws, right? Fighting to get Dalit access to land, you know, fighting for, because a lot of times land reform is truncated because dominant caste communities will take land that is supposed to be earmarked for Dalit communities, and they will still find ways to appropriate it. And more recently, rural unions have become more militant on that. And what I think, I don't know if this is something Tanya is getting at in the question as well, structurally, as small and medium farmers are entering into livelihood crises, right? At a structural material level, this is drawing them closer to laborers too, right? You have families of farmers where some in the family will go work in a laboring capacity as well, right? So things are being fragmented in that way. And I think on the ground, you're seeing some of that. And then more broadly, a shift to a corporate agriculture is not going to benefit laborers as well, right? I think that's an analysis that Nadeep Kaur and those who have brought laborers to the protest sites were very clear about. And maybe one point to also add is the third bill around the Essential Commodities Act, right? That it would limit the stock holding or allow grain trading companies to corner stocks and hold stocks. This could have a really deleterious impact on food availability and the price of food. So it could be buy low, sell high, which again, would not be good for laborers either. Yeah, so we can come back to that, but Nilesh, I'm not sure if there's other questions or.
There are. So again, such a rich discussion, a lot even in there that I would love to hear more about. But let's move to the next question. This was posed by Elizabeth Vibert, and she asks if the panel could speak in a little more detail about the quote, all sorts of new ideas, unquote, for agroecological and socially just agriculture that permeate the camps.
So maybe I can just sort of mention one thing that's really interesting. That all sorts of ideas in the sense, I think sometimes people get a bit exasperated about, so what should happen? What should it be? You know, you don't want this, what do you want? And it's just important to kind of highlight there are so many possibilities and so many ideas, and to direct people to do the patient work of reading. Lots of sort of important things have been written, and people have kind of spelled out different possibilities, from more sustainable crops to greater autonomy, and sort of challenges to kind of political authority and sort of everything in between. One model that people have kind of forwarded is, of course, when the government changes if there's different state support for certain crops, then one is not sort of beholden to growing something like rice, which is an alien crop to Punjab and sucks up groundwater and doesn't belong in a region that doesn't have the same kind of monsoons that happen elsewhere. But there are possibilities for sort of collectivized agriculture, small-scale collective agriculture, in the sense of finding intensive crops or crops that require intensive sort of attention, but rather than the half-acre, 2-acre, 3-acre person trying to manage all of the inputs and the sort of costs of equipment and such, banding together with 10 or 15 or 20 other people and creating a sort of plot of 100 or 200 acres and collectively working on it and collectively sharing the risks and collectively distributing the rewards. And actually, it is Dalit organizations, it is landless laborers who have been kind of at the forefront of these kinds of experiments because they're already landless. But in the places where they've managed to gain access to their stipulated 1/3 of common lands, Dalit families are able to kind of collectively pool their resources together, buy equipment, and cultivate larger tracts of land, and then distribute the sort of output amongst themselves. And maybe this is the kind of ideological barrier that those who think of themselves as landowners and sort of land-owning castes might see a future in, because they are, as Bikram said, on the brink of landlessness anyway, and they're living kind of precariously in small holdings. And if they come together, they can kind of produce agriculture in a viable way that is not so expensive, that is not so dependent on chemicals, and have more viable holdings. I think those are independent initiatives, but it does remain a political struggle to ensure that there is actually state-supported infrastructure. Because the reason we're in this mess is because of state infrastructure. And what the government is doing is now pulling out that infrastructure when the demand has to be to change the infrastructure. So we got to kind of keep that in mind, that independent initiatives are wonderful, but if you actually want something to scale across the board, it has to be part of a government sort of program. And that requires the political fight, and that's what we're witnessing on the borders of Delhi.
Natasha, did you want to, I think you had mentioned, no? Okay, I know you kind of already answered the question. I felt like about, Nilesh, I believe Elizabeth's question was what some of the new ideas that are fermenting. I know you had you had mentioned Langar, and I think you had already suggested towards.
Oh, I didn't know if it was that, like cultural stuff. I thought it was like.
Well, no, I think, but like I found the point on Langar really interesting as well, because and Natasha had mentioned it at the outset about kind of at the sites, right, at the camps, on the ground, that there is almost, we can see something prefiguring some, like, I mean, maybe I was reading too much, or I was being too inspired and moved by your comments, Natasha, when you were speaking. I was like, yes, okay. It almost, when you were describing it, it sounded like a world being born almost. And again, that's maybe overly dramatic, but I mean, we have to, I think, kind of hold both Navyog's emphasis on structure but how these things get worked out in moments of crisis, and the transformative, prefigurative kind of signs that we're able to identify, right? And so something like Langar, maybe I would say that's one thing that does get at Elizabeth's question in an interesting way, right? So Langar is a Sikh institution, which in my view is at the heart of our faith around, to eat in common, to serve before you eat, right? And the way in which Langar has been mobilized in these protest sites around the sharing and the distribution of food, the way it brought together Sikhs and Muslims in really interesting ways, the way it cut across caste, the way it addressed food insecurity in Delhi. Actually, people who were food insecure were able to access food by going to the langar sites at the protests, right? So these were incredibly, I think, these are also prefigurative. I don't know, Natasha, did you want to jump in or?
Yeah, I am inspired by it, and I think that they're responding to the material needs of this community, right? And they're doing it in a way that it's through religious practice that they understand, that they know, that they share in common, and there's it's the seva combined with the langar, and that you build a city in 101 days, feed every inhabitant of that city, right? They all have access to food, to water. None of this could have been created without the Sikh practices that undergird that, right? Like, it is langar and seva that is enabling that. And it is meeting the material need of the protesters at the site, right? And I think that we need to understand how remarkable it is, and they're doing it when the state fails to do it, right? So like you said, it is everyone in and around Delhi is showing up to eat. It's not just the protesters that are eating, they're also providing schools. So for those students who don't have access to internet and cell phones and who cannot attend online school due to COVID, they're showing up to the protest sites and are attending schools, right? That are occurring there at the site. So there's this combination of, right, like the political meeting a real material need, and how else do you build community and build it so quickly and sustain a movement for such time without religion, caste, class, gender getting in, right, the way and limiting, right, the movement.
And maybe just I can add quickly, Natasha, I know we want to get through as many questions as we can, but we should just also say that langar is a revolutionary institution that travels with Sikh wherever they go. So people in Vancouver can see langar being served to folks, homeless people there. There's langars being set up in Texas during this kind of storm that has kind of disrupted people's lives, and being set up at the border between Britain and the continent when there was that shutdown in Dover. All sorts of places this institution is there, and as Bikram and Natasha pointed out, it transgresses and violates the logic of purity and pollution across gender, caste, and status and hierarchy. And so it's much more than just charity. It is actually a profoundly radical act. And I think maybe the question then is to see the sort of take insights from langar and then use our imagination to take them further into other kinds of social relations and find ways to kind of actually contest hierarchies of other kinds and come up with different ways to relate to each other.
Sorry, Nilesh, I also just want to jump in one more time, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Elizabeth, the question, I think it speaks to a paper I've actually just co-authored with Elizabeth and some others at UVic, where the title of the paper was Structural Transformation or Next Meal, I believe. Elizabeth, if I'm wrong, you can correct me. But around new ideas, I think Nabyug's point was really essential there around, okay, so it's important to think about the flowering and emergence of ideals around collective agriculture, langar, and what's happening, but not to let the state off the hook too, right? That the need for state, that we cannot resolve or shift to a post-industrial agriculture. Because I think that's really what's on the table here. Punjab has been so devastated, right? We know what happened in the 1980s and 1990s during the repression of the Khalistani movement. But the land and the waters of Punjab have been so harmed over 30, 40 years. And again, this wasn't the only option at hand, but the question of post-industrial agricultural transition, right? Now, what the state has done in relation with capital, the strategy it has taken over the last 30 years is strategically withdraw investment from agriculture and then say, look, there's a crisis, right? Oh, we need investment. And this is something that the World Bank and IMF have repeatedly done across states across the global south. Oh, look at African states. They have a crisis of underinvestment in agriculture. They have a crisis of storage capacity. They have a crisis of irrigation. We need to bring in private players to invest. Well, why is that the only mode of investment? Why don't we not have a robust taxation regime that can redistribute wealth from the Ambanis and Adanis and invest in a storage capacity and invest in a form of agriculture and industry in the countryside that doesn't require handing it over to profit-seeking players on a large scale? And I think, like Navyag was saying, has said, from the Anand Prasad resolutions to the Naxalites, these alternatives have been on offer for decades, right? And so I think it's also not to let the state off the hook. And I think the protests are doing a very good job of not just putting forward a potential different form of food politics and agricultural politics, but laying a claim upon the resources of the state, right? To not let the state off the hook either.
Just wanted to say, there's a question that I'll get to very quickly, but thank you very much, Bikram, for that. And I'd like to just tie that back to the comments of Natasha and Navyag, that there are pre-existing traditions, cultural practices, sources of inspiration, wisdom, and approach to life that are not ever, or rather have not been destroyed in any of these moments of transition. Yet they, as Bikram mentioned, are not necessarily the only space in which either a critical or an embodied relationship to any of this would happen. The state is essential. One question that came in is by Bikrum Gill, who asks, can you please talk on a shift towards a human rights discourse away from the root issue of capital exploitation? Is the co-option of the movement for performative politics, and how much is this affecting the message, if at all?
So Nilesh, I don't know how many questions they're kind of floating around. Do you want to say a couple of them so we don't, because sometimes we just sort of go on, and I feel like I wouldn't want somebody who sat through this conversation to not get their question heard, right?
As of now, that is the remaining question.
Oh, good. Okay. Bikram, do you want to, or Natasha, what do you guys think?
Yeah, if it's okay. This is something that I've thought about quite a bit and that I've been concerned about as well. Is it was so great seeing when Rihanna put out a tweet, right? And everybody's like, oh, Rihanna's on her side. Then Greta Thunberg does it. And then when Mina Harris did it, I was like, well, wait a minute. What is happening here? Because, Mina Harris and that whole, the Kamala Harris's family is so tied up in the politics of Uber, right? And like, I know myself coming from a family of cab drivers on one side and a family of farmers on the other, like before the farm protests, many people in our community, the big crisis we faced was what Uber had done to our livelihoods, right? Like it was just, and so those tweets seem to be suggesting it was strictly a contestation around this kind of Western, the way it always is framed is, okay, this is about human rights. It's about democracy, and it minimizes the question of the interests of capitalists and how they are seeking to overtake the agricultural sector, right? And I think that's something we have to be really mindful. And the reason why it's also really important is the thing that concerned me around the embrace of Rihanna and Mina Harris and Greta Thunberg is that it suggests, it really conceals the way in which Western states and capitalists are so invested in the Indian farm laws. Okay, the Biden administration criticized India for its so-called repression of human rights, but it backed the farm laws in the same statement, right? Trudeau cautioned the Indian government against a repression as it continues to aggressively, not just in India, but across the global south, aggressively push to dismantle supports to farmers, right? And that's something that is really you have to be mindful, not let the narrative shift. And I'm just going to emphasize one last point here that directly connects Uber to these protests that a figure like Mina Harris will not emphasize, is that Uber is a data harvesting model of capital accumulation, right? A story of the farm laws and the protests that I have touched on, and I hope if I can ever finish this article that Navyug kind of pushed me to start many months ago, and I don't know where it is right now, I'll find it, but is we're living also through a shift towards an agri-tech model of agricultural production. So whether it's Cargill or Reliance, we have to keep in mind one of the big players, the Ambani family with Reliance, they're seeking to promote an app, the GeoKrishi app, right? That is seeking to take over the Indian agricultural trade from farm to fork. They want farmers to sell their produce through this app, and they would like the consumer to buy it through the app, right? To take total control over this. Now, the purpose isn't simply profits, but to harvest data, right? It's a platform, as we know, AI capitalism is trending in this direction. Cargill, the company I emphasize, they have complained for many years that they've lost their monopoly. So Cargill, these grain trading companies, they operate through arbitrage, right? By controlling a monopoly of information so they can buy low in one part of the world and sell high in another part of the world. They've been complaining, well, with the kind of spread of information through the internet and so forth over the last 20 years, we've lost our monopoly, and they're seeking to kind of develop it through agri-tech. And so they're all developing these apps, right? And so in a similar way in which Uber, through its data harvesting model, undermined the livelihoods of cab drivers kind of in the global north, similarly, and a point that people may be interested in is really significant, Facebook is a major investor in Reliance's GeoKrishi app, right? And so the way in which the human rights discourse, while important, if it becomes the only primary or the prominent discourse, it can minimize how Facebook, how an Uber, how agri-tech capital is actually the driving force behind the BJP government here, right? Like, why are they so insistent on this, right? It doesn't make sense in the face of to keep pushing it forward. Anyways, but good question.
Yeah. I mean, I maybe just want to add one quick point. I think it's an important explanation that Bikram has given us. I think maybe what this protest will do is force us to reconsider our own investments and our own commitments. And I think one way to look at it might be the difference between sympathy and solidarity. That one can be sympathetic, right? You kind of see farmers getting tear gassed in water cannons and you see them in the bitter cold, so you have some kind of sympathy for them. But what would it mean to actually be in solidarity and to kind of push the agenda to meaningful solidarity? And that's where I think the farmer and laborer unions have been extremely adept and sort of shrewd at putting forward a message from all sorts of mediums that here is what the issue is. It is about neoliberalism. It is about deregulation. These are policies that are being pushed by the global north. And so if you actually want to stand in solidarity with us, that is the horizon we must confront. And so I think it's a matter of sort of putting those issues on the table. Think about a parallel happening in this society with the Black Lives Matter rebellions that happened over the summer, right? One can see a police officer strangling an African-American and we can react in horror. But it's not enough to just be outraged and shocked by that. The issue put on the agenda was defund the police. It was about abolition. And then that becomes the horizon of you have to now adjudicate where you stand to that, right? Not just sort of sympathy with some tragedy, but take the other step to make the move for real solidarity and then follow that trajectory wherever it may lead.
Just to give a little kind of a different view about the Rihanna tweet. The protesters themselves were elated, were so happy. I mean, the response, right? Like the song within 24 hours puts out the song, right? Riri. People were so happy that this happened because it gave an international spotlight to the protests, especially at the moment that it happened, right? After January 26th. And so I think that, yes, you know, there are concerns around it being framed as a human rights issue, but if we think about it in strategic terms, for the protesters, it was actually very important for this to happen because it brought it into international news again in a way that it was somewhat in November. And so they welcomed it. They aren't unhappy with Rihanna tweeting about them. They want that happening and they want more of it. But what has not shifted is their understanding of the struggle. They continue to talk about Modi, the Modi government and the BJP as fascists, and they continue to talk about their protests as a anti-corporate, right? That's the language, anti-corporations, and they name the corporations, and they're very clear on both fronts, the fascist and the kind of corporate front, as they celebrate Rihanna.
Right. Irresistibly sort of add a quick point. Oh, Bikram, you have one? You want to say?
Yeah, no. I was going to say, and we must always celebrate Rihanna for sure. I think I would join them in big fan of Rihanna's. I think, yeah, it was just, I think to build on something Navyug said, I think it's understandable why there's an embrace of the tweet, especially when you're confronting such a repressive context. That it matters, but I think the concern was more seeing the inside-outside narrative developing, that this is a problem internal to India, and the BJP reproduces it. You know, the problem is coming from the outside, you know, whereas like a lot of the coverage was like, okay, the problem is only coming from the inside, right? So the global entanglements sometimes get lost. But I just wanted to build on just quickly one thing Navyug mentioned around solidarity versus sympathy, right? Not to look into South Asia to see a problem that is entirely local in scope, that must require a form of feeling bad for the people. And going into solidarity, it can take us back to 1999, before the war on terror, right? We can remember anti-World Trade Organization protests, massive, the battle in Seattle. What was a key issue at the heart of the Battle of Seattle? It was precisely agricultural globalization, right? We forgot about this because September 11th happens and the anti-globalization movement is entirely repressed, right? And everything becomes centered around the question of terrorism, right? But before that, the primary kind of tension in world politics was global South states confronting global North states in Cancun, in Doha, right around these subsidy regimes. So I think there is a model of politics of solidarity that were at hand that involve unions from the North connecting with unions in the South. Yeah.
I would just add that I want to sort of something that sort of also gets lost in this is that the importance of diaspora solidarity. There is no Rihanna tweet without the protests that have happened in front of Indian consulates and embassies across the world, week in and week out for months. And we're used to the big cities in the Vancouver and London and New York or Toronto, but actually lots of small towns and you know, sort of places that you wouldn't even expect. People have been protesting in front of consulates and embassies and elsewhere and making their voice heard. And lots of it is kind of thankless. Like nobody really knows, you know, it doesn't get the kind of fame and sort of acclaim, but that independent initiative of people to do this and organizing through social media and elsewhere is what kept this issue on the agenda globally. And from there, you see sort of Western news organizations haphazard, belatedly sort of catching up and saying, oh, actually, we do got to kind of cover this story. There is something kind of going on, and them kind of scrambling to get some reporting on it. That is, I think, what has sort of accumulated with the new attention it has received, and you know, celebrities and others sort of bringing more attention to it.
I'm afraid we're going to have to close, but just one point that I'd like to make in closing. First, thank you to all of the wonderful panelists and the very rich discussion that we've had, but also on the last point that was made, we can identify stances, and we could say hypocritical stances from those in power in the global North, as was mentioned, Canada, the United States, but we also have to always keep in mind that there are other sites of solidarity, unions, activists throughout the world who are not in a sense distracted by or misled by various other sources of information. We are over time, so thank you to everybody, and I hope that the conversation will continue.